Jesus Christ. All right, so hopefully some of you have gotten a chance to read St. Gregory of Nyssa's On the Making of Man. It's a very good introduction to patristic theology on creation, the creation of man, and what it means to be human, which the word for that is anthropology. So I wanted to go ahead and just dwell on this book for this class and review it because it has so much of our theology in it that's so foundational for understanding everything else. So it has 30 chapters. I'm not going to review each one in depth. Some of them I skip over, some I have like one or two sentences on, but we're going to just work our way through that book. So starting with, not sure why my screen isn't staying on. Let me try something here. Starting with the first chapter. St. Gregory begins with, like many of the other church fathers, talking about how this, showing creation as something beautiful, something good, and this divine artist creating everything, and it not being a cosmic battle between the gods and not the result of bloodshed and deicide and all that type of stuff. So that's kind of how it starts out. And he even uses some lovely poetic type languages. He says, "All the beasts were rejoicing, we may suppose, and skipping about, running to and fro. Every sheltered and shady spot was ringing with the chants of the songbirds. All the wealth of creation by land and sea was ready, and none was there to share it." Chapter 2. We haven't lived with a king in the West in a very long time. Not like a real king. I know Britain still has their monarchy, but it's not really an actual monarchy. It's so it's a little hard for us to imagine, but centuries ago, whenever a king would go to live somewhere, somebody would, or a bunch of somebodies would go ahead of him and prepare the palace, prepare everything, make sure everything's beautiful, make sure, they've got the fatted calf there for eating and all that type of stuff. So he relates the creation of the world in that sort of way, that, God was preparing the world for us and our arrival here. And so that's why there's all these days of creation and all of the creation of all the creatures and everything that precede our own creation, because we have been set here as the rulers of creation. And it's really quite amazing that God would do this for us, because he doesn't owe us anything. We haven't done anything to even deserve that, especially not before we were created, and especially not after we were created. We did far more to show we don't deserve that. And yet God does so out of his love and mercy and grace. And so we see that in his second chapter. That's kind of the point that he's trying to make there. Let's see here. In the third chapter, he covers something that we've already covered, so I'll just mention it in passing, that, when God creates man, he puts a lot of care into it. It's not like he just spoke us into creation like everything else. He kind of stoops down to create us and blow his spirit into us and everything, and it's a very intimate sort of thing as he creates humanity. In chapter 4, he talks about how one of the ways that we are made in God's image is by being rulers, which is something that St. John Chrysostom also pointed out in his homilies, if you remember from those lectures. And then in chapter 5, St. Gregory goes on to list a bunch of other things that express how we are the image of God. Does anybody remember what any of those other things are? All right. So he says, "Our Maker painted the portrait to resemble his own beauty by the addition of virtues." So we have the ability to be virtuous. And so that's one way. We see in the original man purity, freedom from passion, blessedness, alienation from all evil. And these things remind us that sin is alien to our human nature, which should give us hope. Because if sin was something natural to us, then trying to overcome sin would be trying to overcome that which is what it means just to be human. But because sin is alien to our nature, because sin is kind of like this foreign invader inside of us, we know that we can overcome it. And we know that it's not something we have to just allow to be. To live in sin is to be less than human. Another way that we are in the image and likeness of God is he says, the Godhead is mind and word, and likewise we possess intellect and logos. God gave us hands, and I thought this was an interesting point. He wanted us to have speech, which is another way that logos can be translated. And so he gave us hands because he was saying if we didn't have hands with thumbs, we would have to use our mouths for everything, just like your dog, right? If you have a dog, you notice that like the dog uses his mouth for everything. And because of that, they have to have a large face and a mouth that kind of is made for that kind of thing, which is not very conducive to talking, just barking and making other noises. So to give us the ability to speak, to give us this logos, he had to give us hands and thumbs so that we could use them for the work that we have to do. Then there is love. God is love, and we are made in the image of love. And so much so that our Lord tells us that people will know we are his disciples by our love. And then the last thing I have here is God beholds and hears all things. We likewise have the abilities to comprehend and apprehend truth and the world around us, and to search for deeper truth than what we already know. So this ability to apprehend and comprehend come from God as well. Any questions on the first 5 chapters? Okay. Chapter 7. In this chapter, St. Gregory makes the case that God purposely designed us without claws, hoofs, horns, thick fur, hard scales, or any other great offensive or defensive characteristics. Do you have a question?
Oh, no, I was just making a joke.
Yeah, you don't want scales or claws or hooves. Yeah. So compared to most of the other animals, we're really not particularly strong, right? Especially if you consider the size that we are and the size that most other animals, like most other animals that are our size, the abilities that they have, the capabilities that they have, the strength, all these weapons. I mean, just as an example, I don't know how many you've researched chimpanzees, but chimpanzees have amazing grip strength, like insane grip strength just in their hands. Their hands alone they can use to literally tear each other into pieces, like just grab each other and rip each other apart. That's how strong they are. And they're smaller, well, maybe close to the same size as us. A little smaller, I think. But we don't even have that. Like, we don't even have this amazing strength. We don't have any claws, any hooves, any horns, nothing cool like that. And St. Gregory says that God purposely designed us like that because he wants to remind us that we need the creatures that he has given us, that we are to rule over them, but we should be kind and gentle rulers because we need them. And he's going to make us physically weak so that we have to remember that. So I thought that was a very interesting point that he makes there. In the 8th chapter, St. Gregory discusses the soul, and I want to make sure I spend a little time here. For those of you who have been through my catechism, you may have heard some of this. St. Gregory begins by saying, man's form is upright and extends aloft toward heaven and looks upward, and these are the marks of sovereignty which show his royal dignity. So we were made for contemplating our Father in heaven. We are creatures that stand upright and can look upright. Not very many animals spend their time looking up. That's something that is fairly unique to humanity. And then St. Gregory introduces the way that the progression of creation. So God made grass first, and then he made the animals, the creatures that feed on the grass, and then he made us. And he made the grass first because the animals that feed on the grass need the grass to eat. And then he made us because we need the animals. And so there's this progression that you see in creation. And he says that Moses reveals a hidden doctrine and secretly delivers wisdom in this progression. And so he then talks about the soul. So the first power of the soul is the vegetative. I'll go ahead and just write this up here, since we'll be coming back to this every once in a while. So it's the vegetative power of the soul. It's what plants have, and it's the kind of this life-giving force that is within the soul. It's life-giving power. The second power is called the animal power of the soul. And that that includes various powers such as desire. So the ability to desire something is something that belongs to this animal part of the soul. Also the insensitive power, which is a word that most of us are not familiar with, but a lot of fathers use it, and that has to do with anger and the ability to feel strong emotion. And so that all ties into this animal aspect. So I'll put desire, emotion. And then the third and final aspect of the soul, again following this progression of creation from grass to animal to human, is an aspect that is found only in humans. Some call it the noetic faculty of the soul. That's what the Greek fathers would probably say. And that is characterized by intellect and logos. When the fathers use the word intellect, as we see it in English, intellect is usually a translation of the word nous. So that is that spirit that is in us. And that's another thing that this is also called is spirit. So the nous is also where we get the word noetic. So when I say the noetic faculties of the soul, that is the abilities that relate to the nous. You'll see these words a lot in the Church Fathers if you read, especially the works in the Philokalia, the works of St. Maximus the Confessor. They are very fond of these terms. So this altogether is called tripartite soul. And that, of course, just means three parts. So the tripartite soul. Now, some of the earlier church fathers, if you go back to, I think, Justin Martyr, so 100s, they will use more of a bipartite soul, and so they will collapse these two categories into one, but say that the spirit is the highest part of the soul. They're all getting at the same thing. It's just like, where do you want to draw the line of demarcation? But it's essentially saying the same thing. I think the church fathers later like to use this because we're made in the image of God. This is tripartite. It starts to look more like Trinity and all that type of stuff. So it works more nicely theologically to split it out like that. Let's see here. St. Gregory sees our soul, body, and spirit as both proof and symbol of the tripartite soul. Interpreting St. Paul, he says, Paul calls one carnal, which is busied with the body, with the belly, and pleasures connected with it. Another is natural, which holds a middle position with regard to virtue and vice. And the third is spiritual, which perceives the perfection of godly life. So, carnal, natural, spiritual. Before the fall of humanity, these elements of the soul existed in a natural hierarchy. The beasts serve man, the grass serves the beasts, and we would see the same in us. St. Gregory explains, if therefore Scripture tells us that man was made last after every animate thing, the lawgiver is doing nothing else than declaring to us the doctrine of the soul, considering that which is perfect comes last. And so this is, I should have maybe flipped it but the natural order at creation would be the spirit oversees the animal, which oversees the vegetative part of the soul. And so when we fell into sin, however, this all gets jumbled. And we'll go into that a bit more later. But we end up serving our desires, being thrown around and controlled by our strong emotions, rather than being ruled by our spirit. There's that one thing where St. Paul says, he's talking about some people and says, and their God is their belly, and so all of that relates to that. Any thoughts or questions on this before I move to the next chapter?
Just that the tripartite corresponds to Plato's Republic, and so that's a treatise that
That's right.
deals
That's right.
primarily in a foundational way with this kind of tripartite, and the city, a well-ordered city, being like a well-ordered soul in that respect.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that, but yes, that's true. Yeah, I remember reading that some time ago. Let's see here. St. Theophan the Recluse has some really good work on this, but the reason that we feel a lack of peace and turmoil inside of us is because everything is out of order. Part of what the church does is give us the tools that we need and the grace that we need to get things back in order. But as long as they are out of order, as long as our spirit is serving these two, we're going to be unhappy. And there's just nothing that can be done about that, because we were made for a natural hierarchy and communion with God that helps us keep everything in order. And when we fell, that severed that communion. And we'll get more into that later when we get into the third chapter. So while we talk about this tripartite soul, it's important to remember we only have one soul. We don't have three souls. These are different characteristics and aspects of the soul, but it's still just one soul inside of us. Okay, so chapter 11. How many of you have seen your mind? What does it look like? What color is it? What shape is it? The mind, of course, is invisible. Spoiler alert. St. Gregory sees in this a parallel with God's essence, which is invisible and unknowable to us. This is one of the ways that we were created in the image of God, by having an invisible mind. I also bring this up because about 1,000 years later, the knowability of God's essence would be a huge matter of debate with St. Gregory Palamas. The Cappadocian Fathers, as well as St. John Chrysostom, clearly taught that God's essence is unknowable. They didn't necessarily use the essence-energies distinction, as we would see later, in such clear terminology. They used other words, but they were making that distinction at this time. So,
Aren't we seeing that in its early form in talking about the person's essence and then their faculties in this text? The distinction between the essence and the energy, so that the senses, the digits, I think it's called, Gregory of Nyssa calls it, like the digits almost become like the energies in the extension of the person, not the essence itself, but at the same time it is obviously the person. Do you see that there?
I don't remember that, but I might have just missed it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds totally legit. I don't remember
like
it.
It was all there. It just he hadn't really explicitly.
He hadn't teased it out
He hadn't
totally.
teased it out,
Yeah,
but it was all sort of there.
Right. Yeah, and there are certainly things in his text that he doesn't totally tease out, but I will, just because of later writings from church fathers or just things that we see going on in culture now and stuff. But if you find that, let me know. That's good. So chapter 12. Our mind or our soul is invisible. But where is it? Where's your soul? Nobody wants to be brave and speculate on this. That's probably the safest thing to do. Nobody wants to be the next Origin. Your soul, a lot of people have this idea that like the soul is in the brain or the soul is in the heart or something like that. St. Gregory of Nyssa repeats teachings of early fathers, and who knows, maybe this came from Plato as well. But he says that the soul kind of is around the body. Like it's not like we have a soul somewhere inside of us. It's that the soul has a body inside of it, which is kind of a crazy way of looking at it. That's like when I first heard that, it's like, what? Really? But then I started coming across it in a lot of church fathers, even one who was writing in the 200s. I think, no, maybe it was late 100s, early 200s. Bishop of Antioch, the name's escaping my mind right now, but he wrote about this, the soul being outside of the body and containing the body. But even that, like, we can't take too literally. It's not like the soul is like some, spacesuit surrounding us kind of thing. It's kind of, he says it's more mystical and more mysterious than that. Yeah.
So it was chapter 6, section 2.
Okay.
If in men, then even though the organs formed by nature for purposes of perception may be different, that which operates and moves by means of all and uses each appropriately for the object before it is one and the same, not changing its nature by the differences of operations. How could anyone suspect multiplicity of essence in God on the ground of his very powers?
Mm-hmm.
See the essence and energy's distinction in that.
Right.
We're in his image and we have organs and faculties, which are our energies,
Mm-hmm.
but we have also an essence.
Right.
That way we're like God.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what I see.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good. Yeah, I didn't notice that, but yeah, that's a good point. So we try not to over-define this like location of the soul. We know that it's not trapped inside the body somewhere. It kind of surrounds the body, and Saint Theophan, the recluse, would say that this is mainly what angels and demons see when they look at us. They see this soul that covers us, and they see what sort of state it's in. Is it in communion with God? Is it kind of bright and luminous? Or is it caught up in sin and more like a pile of dung and dark? And he says, when it's caught up in sin and it's more like a pile of dung, then it attracts the demons just as a pile of dung will attract flies. And so kind of the more you give in to sin, the worse it gets. And I think probably most people know that from experience, that the more you give in to something, the harder it is to get out of it. The more the thoughts bombard your head. And so we see that reality with us, spiritually speaking. The soul or the mind then acts upon the body in whatever ways the body is capable of receiving the actions of the soul. So the brain, for example, is highly capable of interacting with the soul. The heart as well. And there's some great anecdotal evidence in the medical field about this. People who get heart transplants, they end up getting characteristics of the person who had the heart. I don't know, how many of you have heard this before? Yeah, so a couple of you have, so this isn't brand news for everybody. But yeah, so we were talking about this in class one day in seminary. I brought this up, and one of the guys happened to be from the medical field, and he was like, I learned about this in medical school, and we looked at some examples, and we have no idea how to describe it from like Western medicine's perspective. Like he said, there's this one case where a lady gets a heart transplant, and she starts like becoming OCD about cleanliness, and she'd never been that way before. And come to find out, the prior person was that way. And then she had a few other characteristics of this prior person as well. And I bring that up to discuss how the soul acts through the body, but it's not like that lady, when she got the heart transplant, received a little bit of the soul of the other person. Like, it doesn't work that way. But the soul imprints itself on us, imprints itself on the brain, imprints itself on the heart, imprints itself on every organ, every cell of our body. Whatever we are doing spiritually, whatever efforts we're making to draw closer to God or to not do that, has an impact on the entire body, because we're this one united organism. You know, it's not like just because I give into bad thoughts a lot, it's not going to affect anything. No, it is actually changing my body's chemistry to give into sin. It's changing things. And so it's important for us to remember that, and to remember everything we do. That's why one guy I listen to sometimes likes to say, you're not going to get away with anything. You don't get away with a single thing, because everything you do will have some sort of impact on you, and probably an impact on others around you in ways that you don't even perceive yet. And maybe if you get to a place where you're more spiritually enlightened, you'll begin to see how those little bad habits changed you in ways that you thought you were hiding, but you really weren't. And it was affecting your relationships in negative ways because of these sins that you're trying to cover up. So anyway, that also applies to, that gives us hope for people who have some sort of mental disability or developmental disability. If you're really caught up in certain forms of Christianity that require you to be able to, accept the faith as they explain it, and, make this acknowledgement that you accept this atonement system and all that type of stuff to be saved, if you're not mentally capable of doing that, then can you even receive salvation? Because you're not able to go through all the hoops and say the prayer and all this type of stuff, respond to the altar call, etc. And so it brings up the question, can those people even be saved? In Orthodoxy, that's not even a question, because it's like, well, you come, you receive the sacraments, even if you can't speak, that's fine, it doesn't matter. We will baptize anybody. And if for some reason putting them in water isn't safe, then we'll find another way to baptize them. But we will baptize anybody and give them the sacraments of the church to try to bring them as close to God as possible. And those people, that's the other thing, is when you understand what the soul actually is, these people who have Down syndrome or autism and are very, very autistic and not very functional, they have a fully functioning and normal soul. It's just their body has something wrong with it, so that the soul can't communicate through the body like it would in a normal, healthy person. And so when we see them in the resurrection, they're going to be a fully normal, resurrected human being, just like the rest of us, maybe even more glorified than the rest of us. And, that's a very hopeful thing to me, they're not lesser humans. They're not incapable of salvation or anything like that. But they're very much so. And their soul is able to perceive things, even if they can't communicate it through the body. So we bring them into the church. We baptize them. And we know that the soul is receiving benefit from these things. So I wanted to just touch on that. Any questions on that? All right. So the 13th chapter, St. Gregory discusses dreams. Now, this is an interesting topic. How many of you have ever gone to a dream interpreter? Somebody who's offered to interpret dreams for you or anything like that? And nothing too wacky that you guys have been involved in. And you guys, did you do anything with your lives? Come on.
I did do that in psychology class.
Okay, yes.
College.
Okay, yeah. So there was some of that in psychology, yes. Certainly, Carl Jung was very fascinated with dreams, very. And so dreams are something that some people love to dwell on. Some people love to try to pull meaning out of every little thing. And so I thought that was interesting that he touches on dreams here. He tells us, St. Gregory tells us that life is a series of cyclical movements. To be in motion of some kind is to be alive. When motion, as physical and mental, ceases, so does life. This is an important concept in his theology that will show up again soon, we'll get into in later chapters. He then turns to the topic of dreams, which he largely places in the activity of the lower parts of the soul, so the vegetative and animal. Because we do not die when we sleep, both the body and the soul continue motion in their own ways. And so, again, because it's alive, it has to constantly be in motion, constantly be moving, doing something. St. Gregory sees most dreams as being shadows and echoes of sensory perceptions that the animal aspect of the soul is replaying and trying to kind of work through. While we dream, he says, the supremacy or the hierarchy of these faculties, that is the powers of our souls, is in some way reversed in us. And while the less rational becomes supreme, the operation of the other ceases, yet is not absolutely extinguished. And that's why dreams are so difficult for us to understand and seem to make such little sense when we wake up and our rational mind kicks in. The animal soul simply accepts things as they are, right? You tell your dog or your cat no or whatever, it experiences this, or you offer it treats, or you say you want to go for a walk. It's like, how many of you have seen that theme that's like, the meme that's, it's like somebody's talking to their dog and the dog's like, oh, feeding time, this is my favorite thing. Oh, walk time, that's my favorite thing. Oh, that's my favorite thing. Oh, that's my favorite thing. What's that?
It says that, I love that, that's my favorite every time.
Right. Everything is its favorite because it lives in the moment, right? It's not thinking about like all the things that it loves and then trying to evaluate, well, what do I actually love the most? It's like it just lives in the moment. Here's something that I love, throw myself totally into it. And that is very much how this aspect of the soul, this animal aspect of the soul works. And that's why animals are generally like that. They don't contemplate the meaning of the universe. They don't do things like that. And even animals that seem to think ahead, that store up food for the winter or something, are really acting more instinctively. They're not, a squirrel isn't sitting there going, let's see here, I bet we're going to have an early winter, and I eat about this many nuts per day, so I'm going to need to stash away about, like, squirrels aren't doing that. Squirrels, I question if they even have brains, many times. They are not, they're not like that. They're living in the moment. And so there's not, like, the way that sort of mind works is much lower than our reasonable faculties. And so we have these dreams where these weird things happen and a world works in its own little way of logic. And in the dream, we just accept it because we're kind of in our animal nature at that point. Like just accepting whatever, like, oh yeah, of course it's that way, and this is that way, of course. And then sometimes you have a weird dream where it pushes back a little bit. Like I had this dream last year where I was in this town and like everything was hard to navigate. Like if you wanted to walk down the sidewalk's like going up and down and like this and like kind of trying to tilt you off. Like it's just everything is designed just terribly. You can't really even drive around because the roads are just so wacky and like everything was topsy-turvy and weird. And like I'm going and like complaining to one of the administrators and he's like, but of course, sir, you're in hell. Like, yes, it's that way. That's the way hell is. It was a very strange dream because everybody there was polite, but it was just like, yeah, but I mean, it doesn't work because that's just the way hell is. So anyway, this is the way dreams are. They're just very strange. So during sleep, Gregory says that the state of the higher soul is as smoldering fire. So, it's not like this higher aspect of us has just died. But it's like, you take a bunch of dry grass and throw it on a campfire. We got somebody who works in a state park. Does that work? Would that put out the fire?
Would it put out the fire?
Right.
No.
Even if I put a bunch on there and just dump it on. No, it's going to smolder, right? And then when conditions are just right, it's going to and it's going to pop up. And so that's the way St. Gregory looks at this, is that this higher element of the soul is kind of smothered for a little while we're sleeping, because this works through our senses. And so if our senses are shut down for the most part while we're sleeping, we're not seeing, we're not hearing, we're not tasting, we're not smelling, we're not touching, we're not engaging any of the five senses, then this, which works primarily through the senses, is also kind of asleep with us. But then once we wake up, it's able to fire back up and begin to take in the world and contemplate things and perceive things through the senses once more. And again, that's why when this wakes up, and this has been doing its thing all night, this part wakes up and it's just like, what was that? I have no idea what I just experienced. St. Gregory also discusses receiving bits of foreknowledge in our sleep, though he admits that these glimpses into that are very confused, ambiguous, and doubtful, and they serve as nothing more than vague enigmas. And that's why the Church Fathers would tell us not to trust our dreams. If you read anything in the Church Fathers about dreams, they will tell you that basically only a fool trusts his dreams and chases after them. Don't do that. Don't be a fool, because they're just mostly this part of our soul doing its thing. And they just can't be trusted. And then even when it's not this part, sometimes, our dreams can be interfered with by principalities of various types, some good, some bad. And so we shouldn't trust our dreams. And if we have a dream that seems important, they say talk to basically your spiritual father about it and work through it. Make sure, even if it seems positive, make sure it's not just your ego trying to puff you up a little bit. And that's what a good, honest spiritual father will try to help you discern. Let's see here. Yeah, so I wrote the divine can also communicate with us in dreams, but this is the exception and not the rule. Our dreams, St. Gregory tells us, are influenced by bodily desires, so the lower soul's desires, needs, and ailments. But also our character and virtues have an impact on every aspect of our soul, like I was saying earlier. Therefore, they shape our dreams. St. Gregory mentions how a courageous man has one kind of dreams, while a cowardly man has another. Yet the higher soul is generally not involved in these things because, like I was saying, how virtuous we are or our lack of virtues, how sinful we are, impact every aspect of us, body, lower soul, everything is impacted by that. And so then that, in turn, impacts our dreams. So any thoughts or questions on dreams? Okay. Anybody online have anything? Alrighty. Chapter 14, St. Gregory just reiterates that we only have one soul, not three. Chapter 15, he talks about, I mentioned that this vegetative part of the soul is what plants have, and this animal part of the soul is what animals have, and then we humans have this tripartite. He says that our soul, because it's been perfected and made in the image of God with this aspect of it, is so far beyond what plants and animals have that it's almost worth saying that plants and animals don't actually have souls. Because our soul is such a different thing because of this third aspect that's made in the image of God. He says that we could pretty much just say that plants don't have souls, animals don't have souls. So it may be a little hard to see sometimes because we are fallen humans and we live in our animal passions much of the time. But when we're not seeking gratification for base desires and we are trying to live in the way that we were actually created to live, we can start to see and understand how our soul is so much different than everything else. Chapter 16, and just feel free to stop me and say, hey, if you have any questions about anything. And same with you all online. If you have anything and you want to jump in, feel free to do so.
You haven't answered the question. He hasn't answered the question. It's the only one anybody cares about anymore about souls, and that's whether or not animals have souls that go to heaven.
Oh.
That good old one.
Yeah, do animals have souls that go to heaven? Well,
Doesn't answer that. Gee,
he-
you'd be a real church father, not answer that question. It's so important to a lot of people.
from what I remember, he kind of hints at it a little bit, just in that to have this aspect is what makes our soul eternal and unable to die, whereas only having these two aspects is more biological, and it dies with the creature. So sorry, Fluffy is not. Even though all dogs supposedly go to heaven, there are the church fathers seem to see otherwise. I do like what C.S. Lewis says on this topic, and that is basically if there is some sort of resurrection of the animals, it will be in and through us, because we are the priests of creation. We offer everything up to God, and everything is going to be recreated by God in us and through us, and our bringing everything to Him and in Him. So if they continue to live, it will be in and through us in some sort of way that we don't foresee right now. So I thought that was a good answer. It's still not a yes, Fluffy's in heaven, but it's something. So chapter 16, St. Gregory continues this discussion on the image of God in us. He begins by countering the pagan claim that man is a microcosm of the universe, which many of us have probably heard many times. He instead insists that man is an image of God, in some sense a microcosm of God, not of the universe. He then moves on to gender, and this will be the thing that will probably end up getting my video banned from YouTube if I put it on there. So that's why I was saying I'll probably have to put it on Rumble, because YouTube does not like these kinds of discussions. But that's all right. We're not here to make YouTube happy. Male and female belong to our animal nature. Male and female are not the divine image within us. That is, they do not belong to that which is higher in the rational part of the soul. So being male and female belong to these parts of the soul, and not this part. The vegetative, because even some plants have gender. In fact, that's where the word originally comes from, is the classification of words, of language and grammar, and then of course of plants. I think it's an almond tree in my yard. They only planted one, and they didn't realize that they come in male and female. And so it's one of the two, and it doesn't produce almonds for that reason. It just produces leaves. Anyway, so that can even belong to the vegetative aspect, male and female. In the words of Christ, God is spirit, although he is beyond that. I think it was St. Maximus the Confessor who wrote that compared to angels, we are very coarse, carnal, and physical creatures, material creatures, because they're bodiless. Angels are essentially mind, soul, spirit, just that. But compared to God, the angels are coarse and carnal and material. When our Lord said God is spirit, he meant in comparison to us. He didn't mean that God is just a spirit, simply a spirit. He meant that, and he was, of course, talking to the Samaritan woman who was caught up in the argument, does God dwell in the temple in Jerusalem, or does he dwell on this mountain that we have? And Jesus is like, no. The answer is no. God's not stuck in the temple, and he's not stuck on this mountain. He's spirit, he's everywhere, and he can't be contained in the way that pagan gods can be contained, as people thought back then. So when we refer to God as he or as Father, we are not assigning a literal gender or sex to God. Spirits are beyond gender, since sex and gender have to do with physical bodies. Animals require sexual intercourse to reproduce because we live in a fallen world with death, which makes reproduction necessary to avoid extinction. God has revealed himself to us as Father because that is how we understand his being and his activities in connection to creation. We stick to the he, him, and father language regarding God because that is the revelation we have received from God. And God knows himself far better than we do, so it's best that we stick with the terminology he has given us. Male and female are a biological reality deeply ingrained within us. While I don't believe in human evolution, evolutionary biologists will tell you that before microorganisms could even distinguish between up and down, they were capable of distinguishing between male and female, and continue to do so to this day. And that makes sense. For a mortal species to survive, one of the most critical functions is understanding how to find a mate. So again, this male-female dichotomy and understanding how to perceive what is male and female is deeply ingrained in our physical nature, in every living creature. And I belabor this point because gender is one of the many things under attack in our society. There are only men and women. Even intersex people only have one functioning set of genitalia. They're not both man and woman at the same time. Those who identify as transgender today have exponentially increased in number, if you haven't noticed. But it's not because there are more trans people. It's because our youth are confused or caving to social pressure, which is very high in the schools. Those who claim their biological sex is not in conformity with the gender in their mind are greatly mistaken, according to the theology of St. Gregory of Nyssa and the rest of the Church Fathers. Now, I say that, and I don't doubt that some people feel legitimately confused or uncomfortable with their biological sex. I'm not denying that gender dysphoria is real and that it is experienced by a small percentage of the population. What I am denying is that the higher rational mind, this noetic spirit, can decide that it has a gender that does not conform with these two. Sex and gender belong exclusively to these two, not to this. So this cannot decide I am not male or female because this does not have male or female in it. It's made in the image of God, and God does not have male and female in him. The lower soul doesn't have the ability to reason through something as complicated and convoluted as feeling incongruity with its bodily sex. Like any animal, like I was saying earlier about the dog, it lives in the present moment. It seeks gratification of desires, and it can feel anger. So that said, I will acknowledge that some studies indicate that in some individuals, because I did a bunch of research on this, I was actually starting to write a book on this topic. So I did a lot of scientific research in the fathers and everything. Some studies do indicate that some individuals who have gender dysphoric feelings may have those feelings from an imbalance of testosterone or estrogen in utero. That is, while the baby's in the womb. Such hormonal imbalance can impact the development of the brain, which in turn can cause boys to be more effeminate than average and girls to be more masculine than average. However, in most cases, if you allow the boy or girl to go through puberty in their teenage years without meddling with them, most of them will, like somewhere between 75 and 90%, depending on the study, most of them will reach the end of puberty and reach the end of their teenage years and be perfectly comfortable with their biological sex, if you don't meddle with it. And that's the main thing. I could say much more on this topic because, again, I've researched it a lot. I've read a lot of books on it, but I will stop there and take any questions you might have.
Hi,
Anything?
Father.
Yeah,
Hi, question from online. How are you?
doing all right.
Thank you. So, question about gender in terms of being part of the more animal state.
Uh-huh.
I think what I'm curious about is if that's true, like if gender is more part of the vegetative and animal state and not part of this kind of higher state, then why is gender still important in the resurrection and in the resurrected bodies? Like when we're celebrating, for example, like the Dormition of the Theotokos, it's, I think, our understanding that she has not ceased to be a woman in her state now,
Mm-hmm.
but she is sanctified as a woman, and that's still important. So
Mhm.
I guess how do we understand the importance of gender, really, is my question, if it's not part of the more spiritual aspects of ourselves?
Well, for one, it keeps us from going extinct. So that's pretty important. It would have stopped with Adam and Eve and their deaths if biological sex was not important to us. But regarding the resurrection, our Lord does say that in the resurrected states, we will live as the angels. And so this biological reproduction through sexual intercourse will no longer be a thing. It will cease to exist. That doesn't mean that gender will cease to exist, because we will still be humans. To be human is to have a body. And to have a physical body is to have some sort of gender. Like, that's just the way physical bodies work. And so we'll have that, but it won't be a defining characteristic, I guess, of what the resurrected body is and our identity from that point on, because it will no longer be necessary to keep the human race alive in the resurrected state. So it's important now more so than anything, and we don't deny that there will be men and women in the resurrection, but it's a much less important thing at that point. Does that make sense, and does it answer your question?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, like, the function or the role of the Theotokos in first state now is, other than hierarchy, not like meaningfully different than the function or state of, say, a male saint.
Except that she's the mother of God, and she'll always be the mother of our Lord Jesus. So that one maybe is not the best example.
Yeah, sorry. And then maybe the comparison is a female saint and a male saint. Let's put it.
Yeah. Right. So St. Mary of Egypt, to pull another Mary. And then St. John the Latter, to use the two examples from Great Lent. Right, so in the resurrected state, they will be male and female, but it won't have the importance that it has now.
Okay. Thank you. That helps.
Yeah. Yes.
Along those lines,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously before humanity fell, humans were created man and woman, and God said it's not good for man to be alone. Was he talking about man as like the gender, or man as humanity? Or is that...
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Well, and that's the tricky thing about Genesis, is the word for man is Adam, and the word for Adam is Adam. And so the word for humanity is both the man, Adam, and that. So it kind of...
Both can be true.
Right, and so it's both. It's not one or the other. It's not good for us to be alone, and that's why you hear, I forget who came up with the saying, we're saved together and damned alone. And that's a very true aspect of how our ecclesiology works as a church. We come together because we need each other. And then even at just an individual level of the family and everything, we need other people around us. We need another human that we can have a very close connection to, a very close, intimate relationship with. We generally need that. Now, some people give that up. That's an element of this, the animal part of us. And it's not a bad thing. It's a natural part of what it means to be human, to want a wife. Is perfectly fine. But it's this part of our humanity, this animal part of us. It doesn't relate to this part, which, when somebody becomes a monastic, they're saying, I'm willing to crucify this to bring this to its fullest potential. And that's a very hard calling, and that's why not very many people do it. But it's certainly a calling that some people have. But even then, the monks who are trying to live in the Spirit are not living alone, because it's not good for man to be alone. They live in communities. And only with a lot of experience and many years of showing they have a great deal of spiritual fortitude are they allowed to go live by themselves. And even then, they usually come back into the community on the weekends. So hermits are a very rare thing in Orthodoxy and Orthodox monasticism, because, yes, it's not good for man to be alone.
And I guess we have no clue what it's like to be a glorified human.
Well, we saw it in Jesus.
Right, okay.
We saw a little hint of it in Jesus, the little bit that it records. It's very mysterious. You can't create any sort of formulas from his resurrected walking through walls, the disciples recognizing him, not recognizing him. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to the reality that we live in now. Right, but we also get it in little hints of it in the saints. So, there's the story of Seraphim of Sarov and him meeting with Moltovilov or whatever his name was in the woods, and having that discussion, and he starts glowing, and it's the soul. It's this soul that is covering him, that is glowing. It's infused with his body, so it's not like he sees this shining, glowing thing hovering above Saint Seraphim or around him, but it's infused with his body, and so his body is glowing with the glory of God and with a soul that is being transformed and transfigured by Christ. So I don't remember the original question, but hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, it kind of does. More questions, but
Okay. All right. Well, any other questions? Yeah.
I was going to say, in response to the resurrected state,
Mm-hmm.
part of what we see in that 40 days is the wounds of Christ.
Yes.
And so our witness, our martyrdom, our sufferings, is in some way connected to the glorified body.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
for example, in the situation of a female saint, take the example of something. In some sense, a woman is saved through childbirth. Now, what does that mean? That's an interesting thing to go down that rabbit trail. But here's a very concrete example. If a woman had a C-section, I could imagine that the scar of the C-section would be part of the glorified body because it's part of the witness and the sufferings on behalf of humanity to bring forth a child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's a sense in which our witness is in this body. This body has a sex, it has a gender. Therefore, the witness that is the glorified body must have, in some sense, must be an icon of that suffering that existed in the state of the pilgrimage to heaven. So it is important because all sorts of things that are connected to our personhood is connected to which sex we are, and that is part of our witness, and that is carried on in some sense in the glorified body.
Yeah.
So that this male-female dichotomy is still important in the resurrected state, even though no one is given in marriage, etc.
Right. It's not for reproduction that it's important. It becomes
witness to the sufferings
right.
that existed. That is part of our glorification. Is a component of our glorification.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And certainly we see in the lives of the saints, the martyrs, showing their scars that they have in the age, like in the next life. They appear to people and say, look at these wounds that I received. And I wrote an article on this once. I think it was entitled something like "When Scars Become Beauty Marks," and that's essentially what has happened. These things are transfigured and become crowns. They become jewels. They become, I'm using figurative language and not literally crowns and jewels, but they become glorified and they become something even more beautiful. And so, yes, it's all part of that. Christ had his scars. Thomas saw the nail-pierced hands. He saw the side. He saw all these things, and all of that is part of our Lord forever. And so it's in part of us forever, whatever we go through. So yeah, I think that's a great point. We are already after 7, and I am about to go into chapter 17. So I think we will just stop there. I was hoping to get through this whole thing tonight, but I guess that was a bit ambitious, especially when we get into topics like gender and dreams and everything else. So anyway, are there any other thoughts, questions, reflections?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what distinguishes like man from animals is our noetic faculty. And Saint Basil in like one of the first 2 homilies, he mentioned something about that too, like the intelligence or intellect being like the distinguishing quality of man, But so like when thinking about like other like species, not humans, that like seem to definitely display some level of intelligence, you know,
Mhm.
like, I don't know. I mean, I guess lots of animals do, but especially ones that with like more, I don't know, more advanced, I guess, sense of what would seem like intelligence,
Like primates.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, things that like use tools or even have like some kind of like burial rituals, you know, like,
Mhm.
is it okay to say that animals like possess some kind of intelligence? You know, it's just like different
Yeah.
from the noetic faculty.
Right,
It's-
right. Yeah, it's certainly some of them are have a very advanced and developed animal soul that is capable of certain things, but you know, there's still like language, for example. This gift of logos is something that's unique to humans. Certainly, animals have warning cries and sounds that they make to alert others, but it's nowhere close to a language like what we're doing right now. There's no animal out there that's capable of this sort of discourse, and so that's one of the things that separates. You know, having logos separates us from the animals, and will always separate us from that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Noetic also it thinks about thinking, so the
Yes.
concept of contemplatio, that you're able to do contemplation. No animal, as far as we can tell, sits there and does contemplation.
Right.
Thinks about thinking, reflective thinking.
Right.
And so there's thinking in terms of rationality, like how do I do this, and this? How do I get to the food bowl?
How do I solve this
How do
puzzle?
I solve this puzzle of getting
Yeah.
to the food bowl? That's rationality. But there's a higher level of rationality that is
A meta-rationality.
A meta-rationality.
Yeah.
Where you're able to think about thinking.
Yeah.
And that's something that the animals can't do. Although C.S. Lewis also says that as domesticated animals, they begin to absorb rationality to the point that we can imagine. He talks about animals talking and things like that eventually in the resurrected state, perhaps.
Yeah.
And things like that, but there's a rationality that is absorbed like by the environment, by domesticated animals, that gets close, but doesn't quite come to the point of this actual reflective thinking that we do.
Yeah.
That is a hallmark of that particular noetic faculty.
Mm-hmm.
Could that almost be like the imprint of the soul, like my soul and whoever, like
Yeah, imprinting itself on. Yeah, I mean, to a degree, but they still have a soul that's only capable of these things,
Right.
and is limited there.
Right,
And
yes.
while this part of your soul can perhaps imprint itself somewhat on that part of their soul, they still are not absorbing logos or anything like that.
In any hierarchy, as you have here, and this is in Pseudo-Dionysius, there's a gray area between the different levels of hierarchy.
Mhm.
So the vegetative state, a plant that climbs is in that gray area that's moving into the area of the animal.
Yeah.
The animal that's domesticated moves into the realm of the noetic.
Yeah.
There's this hybrid level in any hierarchy
Mm-hmm.
that it holds some of the hierarchy within itself, but it's not fully within that level of the hierarchy. So
Yeah.
there's this blurred area that exists in any of these categories.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. All right. Good thoughts and questions. Anything else? All right. Well, we will stand and sing "It Is Truly Meets."